Support it.
Colin King.
Mr Speaker, it's indeed a pleasure to take a brief call on the Education Amendment Bill number 4. May I congratulate the superb chairmanship of Alan Peachy and the cooperation from all those parties that were on the Select Committee. I'd also like to acknowledge the officials. This is a bill whose time has arrived, and on that basis, Mr Speaker, I think I commend it to the House with great conviction.
Moana Mackie.
Nice to see the government members working so hard to pass the legislation that they're just so passionate about. Mr Speaker, Labour will be supporting this legislation, and we are supportive of most of the provisions within it. Where we become critical is in the broader area of tertiary education, and the kind of blinkered view that government members and that ministers are taking when it comes to this piece of legislation and the impact of other changes they're making in the tertiary education sector. And how, in many ways, there are clauses of this piece of legislation that we're going to pass this afternoon which may, in effect, become redundant or out of date within weeks of this piece of legislation being passed. Certainly, as my colleagues have said, we do support the establishment of the export education outfit. We do think that it's a good idea to get standards in that area. Too many organisations have been going overseas and calling themselves the New Zealand Institute of such and such, which carries with it a certain expectation of quality which unfortunately has not been there in many cases, and we do believe that regulation in this area will be for the benefit of all New Zealanders. When we come to the only part of this bill really that has been contentious, it's around the area of the setting of student levies, and this really does need to be looked at in the broader sense of funding for the tertiary education sector and the current environment that they find themselves in, because whilst the capping of levies that can be charged to students is a good thing, we absolutely agree with that, and we've seen across the country how student levies have shot up, and we want to be able to reduce the cost of tertiary education to our students as much as we can. The fact is, you cannot just look at that in isolation. We need to look at the reasons why those student levies have increased as dramatically as they have. And what we know is that because of funding cuts in the tertiary sector, tertiary institutions have been cross-subsidising. They've actually been using that student levy to pay for things such as staffing, which is a core function of any university or polytechnic or any other tertiary institution around the country, paying for staffing out of that student levy. And because they've had their funding so constrained, their core funding from government so constrained, because as we heard the comments from the Vice-Chancellor of Canterbury University saying that they've basically been told that funding will go backwards over the next 3 to 5 years under this government, they've had to look elsewhere in order to fund things that have traditionally come from government funding. And one of those things has been something as core as staffing. And I remember in the first budget that was introduced from this national-led government, one of the first things they did was they cut the funding, the assistance fund, which enabled tertiary institutes to bring experienced academics out to New Zealand to work in our universities, to add to their research program, to add to the quality of teaching, something that goes on in every country around the world. Tertiary institutions are constantly involved in a transfer of knowledge and a transfer of the individuals who carry that knowledge. But the reality is that in order to be able to match the salaries that these individuals are able to attract in other countries, there needs to be a little bit of assistance. And there was a fund that was there that enabled tertiary institutions to do that, and that funding has gone. Well, tertiary institutions are not going to want to see their standing in the world go backwards because of this. So they've naturally looked to other areas to be able to supplement their funding for such things as bringing overseas experts into this country to add value to the tertiary education sector in this country. And one of the areas that has been looked at is the area of the student levy. Well, that's not what the student levy was proposed for, and in that respect we support the Minister's ability to say very clearly these are what the student levy is for. Students deserve to know what their levy is going to pay for. They deserve to know how it's going to be set. They deserve to have input into that process. But it cannot be divorced from the core issue, which is a constraining of funding in the tertiary education sector. That's why the tertiary institutions have done it. They haven't done it because they want to rip students off. They haven't done it because they're wasting money. They're doing it because their funding from government is going backwards. And government members have not referred to this in any way when they've been speaking. They've looked at it in isolation, this bill in isolation from the reality for our tertiary education sector, particularly for universities. And on this side of the House we say, while we support the provisions in this bill, you cannot look at it in isolation. This legislation does not exist in a vacuum, and if the government is going to continue to constrain and cut funding for the tertiary sector, then we are going to, the idea that the National Party is aspirational for New Zealand is a joke, quite frankly, is a joke. If one of the most important sectors in this country, is going to end up going backwards and falling backwards in international rankings because of funding cuts. And I'm interested to see the member from Hamilton guffawing at that. Of course, he has a university in the city that he lives in who is also not happy about the constrained funding environments under this government, so he can guffaw all he wants, but he knows, I'm not sure what his name is, but he knows very well what I'm talking about. And the other reason that we've been saying the other area in which you cannot look at this piece of legislation in isolation is in relation to the legislation currently put forward by the ACT Party around voluntary student membership. Because currently we have a system in most of our universities in New Zealand where we have compulsory student membership of student associations. The fee's not that expensive. It provides an extraordinary amount of benefit for the fee that's paid. For those members of the Student Association who really strongly object, there are conscientious objector provisions in the legislation that they can use if they want to. But the reality is that most students are happy with the services that are provided by their student association because they know that they are a lot cheaper than they'd be able to get if they had to pay for them outside of the student association, and they know that the student associations provide these services on a much more cost-effective basis than if the institutions themselves were providing it or if they had to go out privately. And these are services like medical services, gym services, creche, food banks, hardship, tutoring, counselling for students who are undergoing stressful situations, a whole range of services that are provided, as well as all the clubs on campus, as well as all the events that are run by the student associations. As part of that as well, you have an elected executive that is involved in the running of the university and the decisions that are made in that regard. So you'd have to wonder what is so broke that needs to be fixed, because all it needs is 10% of students to say, hey, we don't like this, to sign a petition saying, hey, we don't like this, and we want to have a vote on this, and the student union, the student association could go voluntary. And in fact, Waikato University, which is in Mr Bennett's city, did that. And they went voluntary and the whole thing fell apart. Just like it did in Australia, where 75% of student services were lost. Whole thing fell apart. You know what? They had to bring it back. They voted to bring it back because it was such a resounding failure. And yet here we are again. And the reason this is relevant to this piece of legislation is because in this bill, in clause 2271B, it refers to the minister when he's setting the student levy, when he's deciding what it will pay for, when he's deciding how high it will be set, where it will be capped, all these things. It requires him to see that arrangements have been made for decisions to be made jointly or in consultation with the students involved at the institution or their representatives. Or if VSM goes through, they won't have representatives. So who are they going to consult with? Because at the moment it's quite clear. At the moment you have a democratically elected student association executive to consult with. Who are they going to consult? Are they going to consult the young Nats on campus, ACT on campus? Of course they will. They'll handpick them. But at the moment we have a system that isn't broken, that is cost effective, that works amazingly well, providing good quality services for students at a price that they can afford, which is often free of charge. We've had universities in New Zealand go voluntary and come back because it was such a resounding failure. And more importantly, under this legislation, there was a clear organisation for the university to consult with on matters pertaining to students. And this is what the government is going to be requiring of them in this clause, requiring them to consult with students. And yet, in their blinkered view, government members who promised not to support voluntary student membership legislation at the last election, breaking that, ask Paul Hutchison, Joe Goodhue. He went to the NZUSA conference and promised that National would not support this legislation. Well, we may be looking at a piece of legislation here that will be out of date within weeks if that voluntary student membership legislation goes through, and I don't think that that's good lawmaking. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Joe Goodhue.
My call will be brief. It really has